Like most people, I often used to dream about an FF7 remake, but I only started playing it a few days ago because so many people had been mentioning it in one of my other videos. I was sort of afraid to play the remake because I really didn't want it to be bad, and I'd heard a lot of negative things about it. So far in my playthrough, I've reached the Sector 5 slums with Aerith for the first time, but this video isn't a review of the game. I'm not going to be talking about what I like or don't like. Instead, I want to talk about some of the ideas being developed and expanded upon from the original. One of the biggest differences I see so far is how much more complex Midgar is. We see more of the city, more various ways of life, more standards of living, and one thing the remake does really well is to show how the population of Midgar is made up of different kinds of people. The catastrophe that we as fans know to be coming is not certain or even important to a lot of the people in Midgar. Cloud is incredulous when Barret asks him if he can hear the planet's cries, and he tells Barret to get help, as if he's suffering from a mental illness. Cloud is unconcerned by the planet's potential fate. He reminds Barret to think about what's in front of him, literally the next 5 seconds. He shouldn't be thinking about what's far off in the future. I think this evokes a real-world problem that many of us face when it comes to causes or social issues that we really care about. Sometimes other people simply don't care as much as we'd like them to. Like most of us, Cloud initially only sees what's in front of him. Barret and Avalanche see what's far ahead, as if the two of them are looking through different ends of a telescope. People are prone to falling into this state of general apathy when their bare minimum standards are met, these being food, water, and shelter. In most cases, as long as people aren't too hungry or too thirsty or too uncomfortable, they're willing to put up with a great deal of tyranny and injustice, even when the world is falling apart in slow motion. Sometimes a catastrophe is the only thing that opens up our eyes, like the falling of the Sector 7 plate, which I think is what does it for Cloud. In the original game, there's not as much in the first hours of narrative to suggest that what Avalanche is doing could be looked at negatively by their fellow Midgar citizens. Though closer to the end of the original game, there is a scene between Barret and Sid when Sid calls out Avalanche for incurring civilian casualties during its bombing operations. FF7 Remake carries this moral ambiguity further. At certain points, the downtrodden civilians of Sector 7 also express their discontent. After all, even when life has become utterly insufferable, the status quo often remains the easiest way to carry on. Change is difficult and frightening, and you're never sure that what you'll end up with afterwards is going to be any better. Avalanche, of course, defends itself by prioritizing the safety of the planet, without which none of these people would be able to exist anyway. We have two moral worldviews at work here, big picture and small picture. Avalanche is obviously looking at the big picture. They understand that innocent people may get caught up in the carnage of revolution, but if nothing gets done now, they're going to perish anyway in the coming disaster. It's more of a utilitarian outlook, which means that the best option is to prioritize the greatest good for the greatest number of people. On the other hand, other citizens of Midgar have the small picture in mind. If the big picture worldview belongs to Avalanche, then the small picture worldview belongs to people like Jesse's parents, who, although working for Shinra, seem like really decent people. They only want to provide their daughter with the best life possible, even if they disagree with Shinra's policies, and it's hard to criticize anyone for that. Shinra is perfectly aware of this aspect of human nature, as the president explains to Barret before the Airbuster boss fight. In contrast to the utilitarianism of Avalanche, ethics like these are deontological, wherein the morality of an action is decided by the harm it brings, irrespective of whatever good consequences may come out of it. Deontology is largely attributed to Kant and its patient-centered morality, meaning that the consequences cannot be used to justify the means. In this moral worldview, Avalanche is unjustifiable because the eventual good that comes from their actions can't be used to absolve them of the means they used to achieve it. On the other hand, Avalanche asserts that the greatest welfare for the greatest number of human beings is really the best that we can do, because if the planet eventually dies, there can be no more doing good for any number of individuals whatsoever. But the game also leaves space for the player to feel slightly uncomfortable with the group's actions. And frankly, I love this, because doing the right thing is sometimes hard. Making decisions that affect the lives of thousands of people is never going to have a single, unequivocally ethical solution. Somebody will suffer while another benefits. This is just the nature of existence. And from this big picture perspective, Kantian ethics begins to show cracks. The planet's extinction is really the only thing that matters in terms of the long-term survival of the human species. But in order for Avalanche to circumvent this fate, it must first cause its own kind of suffering in the world. Things must get worse before they get better. There is another moral worldview at work, which is expressed to Barrett by a shinra worker when they're riding the train. His essential point is that change ought to be carried out peacefully by participating in the appropriate government channels to facilitate progress. Though the game makes him sound a bit feeble in his delivery, there's a good point being made. This is an inherently conservative viewpoint. The conservative worldview tries to hold on to the best of what we currently have, rather than letting it get destroyed for the sake of potential progress. And historically, revolutionary impulses sometimes do more harm than good. For example, when a country's government is toppled in a revolution, this makes a very dangerous power vacuum, and you never know who is going to step into that vacuum. The revolutionaries may have started off with good intentions, but nevertheless make it possible for someone like Stalin to step in and make things even worse than before. If Shinra were to be toppled, it's not necessarily the members of Avalanche who step in. In a post-Shinra midgar, Avalanche might have to vie for control with the Turks, for example. The Turks would be a classic example of morally ambiguous opportunists. Not necessarily evil, but selfish. I might call the Turks Nietzschean, in the sense that might is right. The strong prevail at the expense of the weak. And maybe there's no moral imperative at work in the universe to say that this should not be so. When I heard the Shinra employee making this speech about slow, moderate social change, a part of me really does sympathize with him, because in most cases, I do believe in the values of non-violent civil disobedience. The argument to be made against Midgar's civilian conservatism is that it only works when the government channels affecting change are actually working, which clearly doesn't seem to be the case in Midgar. There's no such thing as small or local government, and the people are completely powerless. It's hard to criticize a person for acting out violently if they're being kept in a cage. It makes me wonder what I'd be willing to do if I was in FF7. Maybe if things were more serious, I'd pick up my Buster Sword and do what I thought was right. Or would I save enough money for another trip to Gold Saucer and let off some steam at the slot machines?